come up on your screen shortly. Great. Well, welcome everybody to today's meeting. My name is Sandy Fazeli. I'm with the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO. Today we'll be discussing Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage considerations for infrastructure implementation. A lot of state energy offices are beginning to think about how to comply with certain provisions within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we've pulled together two experts from states that have been through this and can share some of the expertise and experiences that they've been through. Just some quick meeting logistics. Please feel encouraged to add to the discussion. Feel free to use the chat or the raise hand features to ask questions and contribute to the conversation. We just ask that you share your name and your agency, organization, or company that you work with when you do speak. If you're not speaking, please keep your microphone muted to minimize disruptions. We will pause for comments and questions throughout the meeting, but again, feel encouraged to drop notes into the chat or raise your hand. And then we will be recording the meeting in the coming days and posting it on NASEO's website. Before we get on to our speakers, I did want to share some resources that are available for state energy offices on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Many of you may already be familiar with the Infrastructure Act Resource Hub on NASEO's website. That's where we keep a lot of foundational information about IIJA, the various provisions, and how we see them being of interest to state and territory energy offices. If there's anything that you believe is missing or that you would like more information on, feel free to contact any of us on NASEO staff. We're really interested in hearing about how states are beginning to plan for IIJA and the resources that we can provide to support you. We also have just launched with E4TheFuture a program in a box website, and E4 was gracious enough to give us a tour of that yesterday on a webinar. This includes programs in a box that essentially can help inspire different program models for state energy offices as they think through how to spend down the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funds. So we'll be covering a bunch of different sectors and technologies and program designs. Currently, the website is populated with our first program in a box, which is really around local climate, clean energy, and resilience planning. So feel free to check it out and let us know if you have any feedback. And then with no further ado, I'll introduce the panel and discussion that we have set up for today. Again, focused on Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage considerations for infrastructure implementation. We'll first be hearing from our partners at E4TheFuture, who have been supporting NASEO and developing different resources and this meeting series focused on infrastructure implementation. Then we'll move on to Eddie Trevino, the director of the State Energy Conservation Office in Texas. I neglected to add Texas to that bullet point. I apologize, Eddie, but you'll hear about Texas's experience with Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage. And then finally, Adam Strong, the prevailing wage compliance specialist for the Michigan Department of Transportation, who will walk through some of the tools and resources that he uses in his role as well. So with no further ado, I will pass the line now to E4TheFuture to share some opening remarks. Pat, are you there?
I think she's having some difficulty joining.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. When she does join, we're happy to include some thoughts from her. So then we'll go straight to Eddie Trevino with the Texas State Energy Conservation Office. Eddie, feel free to take it away.
Sandy. Yeah, I am here, and let me share my screen. Hold on just a second. So all of you remember Davis-Bacon when we had the fun and good times of participating in Davis-Bacon compliance reviews during AURA. And you know, as time goes by, you remember things a little differently than what they actually were. And so this perhaps is your vision of what a certified payroll review was like back in the day. Our vision was, this is what it was like. It's navigating a path that was treacherous and perilous, and had a lot of little nuances that you had to navigate. We still have our AURA revolving loan program. We actually have loans out right now in that particular program, and this feels like the pathway that we're taking in terms of our Davis-Bacon experience. Unfortunately, like everybody else, sometimes we get our nose bloodied in the process. So what I'm here to tell you about is our experiences with Davis-Bacon. I'm going to focus on our current experiences, and the reason I'm doing that is because all of our contract managers that we have now, they were not around during the Davis-Bacon and during the AURA period. So we've actually started over in our Davis-Bacon review process and getting everybody up to speed. And so we're actually experiencing some of the bumps in the road that perhaps some of you all are experiencing, or maybe will experience going forward. The main information that we receive are the certified payrolls. The big difference was back in AURA, we would get handwritten 347 forms. This time around, we're not accepting handwritten 347 forms. In fact, one of the vendors that we were working with has that Department of Labor form on an Excel spreadsheet, which is our preference. So we want it in a PDF with the spreadsheet as a backup. Is how we receive that certified payroll information on the projects that we have currently in process. As you know, there are prevailing wage rates that everybody has to comply with, and they are, in Texas, it's different for different parts of the state. So you have to deal with that mechanism. You also have to deal with the fact that in SAM.gov, there are a lot of common labor categories. So you need to know which labor category does our review fall under for that particular person. We've struggled with that. One of the things that we do now is that when a vendor submits a reimbursement request to us, we not only require the payroll form, we require them to tell us to submit the SAM prevailing wage rates for that particular area they're in, and we require them to circle or highlight those wage rates that their labor falls under. And at that point, what we do is we meet with the vendor and we actually review all those wage rates for all of their payrolls that they have in place. And as you can imagine, the larger the project, the more the involved, a different number of trades, the longer it takes to complete that review process. So we meet with them on the very first reimbursement request, and we do that because we want to make sure we get off on the right foot. So all of our contract managers, for every project that they do that involves Davis-Bacon, they are responsible for conducting the Davis-Bacon review and compliance review, which is kind of scary for us with infrastructure coming down the pipes and our contract managers. It's going to limit the number of projects that they can review if we continue the same model. So we're looking at different models. In AURA, what we did was we actually contracted with payroll specialists and had them actually their contract labor in-house, and they specifically were dedicated to reviewing those payroll requests. We don't know if we're going to follow the same process. We considered using software as a service back then. It's evolved greatly since the AURA time. But one of the concerns we had was always ownership of data, retention after the contract is over, who owns the payroll records. So we always had those questions, which is why we defaulted to managing and reviewing those compliance forms in-house. So the other, we're getting up to speed. We're not as good as we should be. And so, and our review process is slow because everybody is new in that particular process. We've taken training, but as you well know, it's different when you've trained and when you actually have to implement it and you're out on an island on your own trying to implement it. So it's one of those areas where we've teamed together and everybody's helping each other navigate through it, working closely with the vendor on the first reimbursement request review. And that's how we're going through the process right now. It's not a fast process. And again, we're always looking for ways to improve the process that we have going forward. There are a lot of potholes in this process for us. One of the prior experiences and current experiences that we have is that the vendor, in our case, it's a loan, they don't have the expertise in-house to validate the payroll information themselves. So what they're doing is they're kicking the bucket down to us, saying that in some instances that they've reviewed it when in fact they've only done perhaps a high level or a cursory review, and with the attitude that that they'll deal with the issues as they take place as we find them. Which is not the best scenario to be in, which is why, again, we encourage their participation in that first meeting to try to minimize the impact of that happening as future reimbursement requests come. We deal with a lot of smaller contractors, and a lot of them are not used to working on federally funded contracts or contracts that have Davis-Bacon compliance reporting requirements. So it's a new game for them. So in many instances, they're guessing, as well as the people that follow them, as to what labor categories and what areas of the state that the prevailing wage should be applied to them. So it's a learning curve for everybody. And what happens is if you have a small vendor on a large reimbursement request and they don't provide the appropriate documentation, what do you do? Do you hold back the entire reimbursement, or do you partial pay and then you have to use your manpower in-house to track those who haven't submitted the correct documentation and keep track of them until they submit the correct documentation and then reimburse them? And you can see that's a really bad tangled web and a mess that you can get into if you're not real careful in the process. What we do in Texas is that we pay everybody or we pay nobody. And we do that as a way of encouraging the prime contractor and the borrower to make sure that they get all of the appropriate information from all of the subs that are required to report. We also face the issues of who has to report? Is it everybody who touches the site? Is there a scenario where you have like construction materials or kind of the cement truck drivers? Do they have to report? Do people dropping off equipment have to report? So we always face that, who has to report and who doesn't have to report. And again, when you have people turning over or leaving the site because they have a minor part of the contract, if you overlook somebody, it's going to be really hard to find them after the fact. So those are items that we try to get out of the way ahead of time as to who has to report and who doesn't have to report. But we're by no means subject matter experts in making that determination. And so we're just kind of working through it with the contractor, reading the CFR when possible as to who has to report. And as you all know, Code of Federal Regulations, sometimes it's not real easy to read and understand. Again, if you have staff turnover and anytime you have staff that changes, you've got to get that particular new staff member up to speed on reviewing the compliance reports. So the third aspect of what we face is that we just don't do it that often. A lot of our projects don't require that reporting. And so when we do it, it's almost like starting over every time we do it, just because you forget things that you should have written down but didn't. and it makes it a challenge. So I affectionately refer the process that we follow as the caveman process, and we're making it through. We're by no means the fastest and the most efficient at doing it. What the advantage that we have is that because all contract managers review all of their own contracts and are responsible for their own Davis-Bacon compliance reviews, it is enabling us as a team to get a lot better at those reviews, to recognize pitfalls, and to know where and when to ask questions. So Sandy, that's our magical process. I'm sure that's so encouraging to everybody, right? And it's just it's not the end of the world, but it's by no means like it's depicted on that particular slide.
Well, thank you, Eddie, for sharing the realities of Davis-Bacon compliance. This has been very helpful. For any questions, we'll plan to go through Adam's presentation next and then open it up for discussion. But again, if you have any questions that you'd like to have answered now, feel free to drop them in the chat and we might be able to get to them in the chat. So next up, I'd like to invite Adam Strong with the Michigan Department of Transportation to share his experience. Thanks, Adam.
Does that look good?
It does.
Fantastic. So I'm Adam Strong. I work at the Michigan Department of Transportation. I've been here for 8 years. My normal disclaimer at the beginning of every presentation, I like to say I work for this state, not your state. I have experience in my state and possibly not yours. So I'm going to be talking a little bit on the highway side about what we do, how we do it, what it used to look like, and what it looks like now. I hope that I can fill in some of the potholes from Eddie's slide, the who's and the what's and the why we do that. But he is correct, right? It's prevailing wage is something that is a skill, and if not tended to, it seems to wither on the vine. So we will talk through some of those things in my presentation. So as far as what Davis-Bacon requires, through looking at the IIJA funding, section 41-101 talks about prevailing wage requirements, and it just generally says that Davis-Bacon applies. For a contract agency letting a contract, you have to have an express written term that Davis-Bacon applies. And there's some talk, there's two different kinds of Davis-Bacon, right? There's the Davis-Bacon Act, which engages entities of the federal government directly. There's the Davis-Bacon related acts, or DBRA, as we affectionately like to call them. That's where MDOT gets a good portion of their money from the Federal Highway Administration, made through loans, grants, or guarantees. Davis-Bacon still applies in that instance, but if you're not an entity of the federal government, you are a related act project as opposed to a direct Davis-Bacon Act project. Eddie did talk about the sam.gov website. It was in beta for a couple of years. It's now just a full-fledged website. If you know what you're looking for, it's relatively easy to do. Again, if it's something that you do all the time, you shouldn't have a problem with it. When you get into some of those more nuanced, searches for a building decision in a given county of a given state, it can get a little convoluted. One of the things the Davis-Bacon Act requires is the weekly payment of wages to tradespeople. That's where some of our newer contractors, people that are not well acclimated or steeped in the Davis-Bacon side of things, get a little sideways. They say, we see your certified payroll form has space for 1 week. How do we put 2 on it? The answer is pay weekly and do them individually. Davis-Bacon generally requires the submission of a certified payroll with an accompanying compliance statement. One of the things that I want to key in on that Eddie had said was, he says, we receive them electronically now. The Davis-Bacon Act itself, if applied statutorily, simply says a certified payroll equals this amount of information. You must give us that in the available WH-347 form or any format desired, as long as all of the information is contained within that submission. You've got a compliance statement. You've got an original signature, which could be a digitally encrypted electronic signature as well. So just applying Davis-Bacon kind of gets you into the minimum requirement, you may want to consider as an agency that's letting a contract, what are some of those things that would give us the ability to do things more intently? Do we want to get paper? Do we only want to allow electronic submissions? What's the format for that? And I think the more you can think through that process in a contract related requirement versus, just saying Davis-Bacon applies, please give us a payroll, the better off you're going to be. Just you can anticipate what a contractor is going to give you moving forward. The other thing, again, like Eddie had said, we're talking review and maintenance of those forms until they've met their retention period. What does the review mean to you? It can mean different things to different agencies based on how much resources they have to put in that direction. We have a policy and procedure that essentially says once a contractor begins submitting certified payroll, we're going to hyper scrutinize the first few submissions to ensure that they are correct and accurate relative to project records, and then we consent to spot checking in the future. Part of that review obviously is going to be fixing deficiencies that are discovered in the review process, number of people, durations by which they work, classifications in which they're shown on a certified payroll. So those things need to be kind of reviewed and addressed as the project goes on. People who get it versus people who don't. The CFR talks about laborers and mechanics. That's the operative language that Davis-Bacon uses. They are generally people who perform tasks that are manual and physical nature, occupations that require tools, or people performing the work of a trade. Your wage schedules are going to be, at least in Michigan, right? So our highway schedule is very good. We've got 215 individual wages on it, and most of them are union rates. So if we had a question about, who covers this, how coverage would be extended, we can always reach out to those unions and say, hey, dear electricians, is digging in a handhole or setting a vault something that you guys would cover? And they can say yes or no. Most of the time, everybody's happy to agree that their occupation prevails. Ultimately, we're talking about the tradespeople again: electricians, plumbers, carpenters, all those folks. You may notice that there is an italicized truck drivers. I could do a very long presentation on truck drivers because it's convoluted. The regulation generally says that truck drivers who only show up on a project for a couple minutes to deliver material are not extended coverage as a laborer or mechanic until such time as they engage with that job in a substantial way, which is defined as 20% of their work week. So it's kind of yes, kind of no, or deal. Again, people who are not covered, all of your professional, mental, or managerial occupations, engineers, architects, estimators. I do have bona fide material suppliers on that list. Those, by definition, are generally people who work for companies that may provide a material, concrete to your project, as well as maybe they're providing that same concrete to a Walmart parking lot approach or something like that. Bona fide material suppliers are generally not within the scope, as I understand it, of contractor or subcontractor relative to the Davis-Bacon Act itself. Biggest common problems that we see, misclassification of workers, right? There are some kickback regulations that accompany the related acts that disallow money being taken from workers. And it's kind of if you paid them the wrong thing, at least you met the minimum. And so understanding that is a reality, some contractors may gravitate towards cheaper occupations when they're unsure, right? So if you can call them a laborer, you can call them a carpenter, and there's a $5 an hour delta, you may try to extend coverage as a laborer and hope that maybe you're right, or what have you. Undercounting workers is another one that we see quite frequently. We do maintain inspector daily reports on our side of the equation on the highway side. And it's not always one-to-one, because maybe someone shows up on the work site, we counted them in the morning, but they're not engaged to perform a prevailing wage activity and are called off the work site. We don't know where people go, what they're doing. The expectation on us is not to keep payroll or to keep inspector reports with the specificity necessary to recreate a contractor certified payroll. When we talk about the payment of prevailing wage, the maintenance of basic records, these are requirements of a contractor. There may be instances where they've fallen down in the maintenance of those records, and we have to go in and make sure that the minimum wage is observed, and kind of get a little bit inventive on how we do some of those things. Yeah, and then inadequate record keeping, it goes right into that. So failure to submit payroll weekly, again, that's just something that we see sometimes. Either, you know, the person's on vacation and we didn't submit it, or you know, I just wasn't aware. You know, if you didn't know that the speed limit was 35 miles an hour and you're doing 70, you're still going to get a ticket for it. So what our paper process looked like. When I started at MDOT, we let $1.2 billion in highway work, and that's about 700 jobs a year. That was a ton of work for the mail person to get all of those things to our project offices. And truly, you know, on the left is kind of what it looked like. That could be one contractor's payroll report. I've seen CPRs that are 90 to 100 pages because they can only include a handful of workers on every page. The form on the right is a form that we've created, which is essentially kind of a receipt of who was on the work site this week, and whether the prime contractor found those payroll submissions to be complete, right? Because prime contractors are ultimately responsible. They're with whom MDOT has a contract to perform work. They're responsible for the contract and the subs that they take. And so each week a contractor would send us all of the payroll reports that they had received and attest to them being generally complete. And we would then take over on the assessment of accuracy. That is a lot of paper. We had a lot of office real estate that was set aside for project files and, you know, cabinets and everything else. When we got those certified payroll reports, like I said, it's not so much a standard form unless your contract requires that. I think you can. I don't see any reason why you can't. But then this is the form that we would go through to assess for completeness. Every contractor's payroll that we're kind of reviewing with a heightened sense of scrutiny, we'd look and say, does it have all the information, right? And since we never went in and said you can only submit the WH-347, a lot of contractors' internal payroll systems spit out a report that satisfies those federal requirements. And then we would have to go in with a highlighter and, you know, here's a contractor's name, here's the location of the project, here's the payroll number. And it was quite an onerous review process. In 2014, we did a pilot project on the largest contract we had ever led at the time, which was $160 million. And the big thing there technologically was that the software that we were piloting allowed us to skip this entire assessment process. They have in the background of the system what's called validation settings, and that's kind of a, you know, do you care about this? How much do you care about this? And so in a lot of these settings, we set them to say, if we wouldn't have accepted a payroll from a contractor absent this information before, we don't even want it to get to us now. And so a lot of these checks, we said, you know, yes, we care about them. And yes, we want to enforce them. And so it truly said, if we were going to give a contractor feedback based on the form on the left, you know, you missed a compliance statement, gross wages, individual daily wages, then we want this system to give you feedback, because we would have been the mechanism to do that in the paper process. And so the system's called LCP Tracker. We have been using it in some way for 8 years. We've processed right around $10 billion in construction value in the LCP Tracker system, which is like 19 million individual payroll records. It's just a lot of data and things in the background. So what we've transitioned our payroll check to, as opposed to, you know, are these 25 things present and accounted for? We're basically boiling that down to, does the duration and day look appropriate? Does the number of humans on the site look appropriate? Did they meet the prevailing wage? Are the classifications reminiscent of the occupations we believe they had performed? And so it's tremendously cut down our time allocated to payroll review and allowed us to focus on other things. The other nice piece of it is it rolls it all up into a little lovely dashboard. This is the payroll dashboard within inside my LCP tracker system. And there's a tremendous amount of transparency there. For my department, transparency is very important, and we can see exactly who's doing what, when it happened. So we can see the contractors on the far left column that were submitting the payroll, what the project was, who the prime contractor was. If it's a blank, then the prime contractor is the person who's submitted the report. We can see, what the week ending is for, when payrolls were submitted, when we approved them, or when the prime approved them, and when we accepted them. So you can very easily see in a nice kind of bucket of information what the status of your project is, who has submitted, who's deserving of being compensated, and who hasn't. We did see, in addition, a 1/3 reduction in duration between when a contractor worked and when payroll was actually due to be submitted. So we were getting payrolls faster, we were reviewing them faster. One of the biggest levers to pull with respect to Davis-Bacon compliance is to impede payments or future payments to a contractor for work that they've already done. And when you have issues that bubble up after a project is complete, getting somebody to come back to that conversation and provide you, a check stub, an updated payroll, something of that nature, it becomes exponentially more difficult. Since I only have 15 minutes, and I hope I'm somewhere near that, I do have some final thoughts. I have provided a handful of links on the screen. Hopefully we can get those links out to the attendees in a way that they can leverage them. The Department of Labor has various field operation handbook chapters. 15 deals with the Davis-Bacon Act and related acts information. There's a lot of good stuff there. Your wage and hour division of the U.S. Department of Labor, there's 2 in the state of Michigan. Getting to know those folks, getting on the phone with them and just saying, hey, what do you think about, this situation? What should I be doing here? What information or guidance can you offer? Seems to be a pretty good way to kind of get some answers, as well as the Prevailing Wage Resource Book, which is something that the DOL puts out also. Hyperlink to my Prevailing Wage website. I've got my full 8-hour training slides on there, a couple of our contract documents, a contact for a gentleman at LCP Tracker in the event anyone is interested in that. Some states are using that as well as on probably the DOT side. I know they've got kind of a smattering of users throughout the state at various levels. And I guess the last thing that I'll leave you with is this. Prevailing wage is something that, if you don't do it a lot, you kind of, lose the acumen for. But your DOTs are probably doing quite a bit of it. So while everybody thinks that, when you talk to one person in a state agency, that's like informing the entire population, and that's never the case. I think that if someone were to come to me and say, hey, I work in a sister agency and I was hoping that you could give me some time, I'd be absolutely happy to do it 100%. So I think that those can be good levers to pull as well. I spend most of my winters training people on prevailing wage and how to do that, which includes a lot of consultants. So we've got a very robust population of consultants at least in the state of Michigan. And those folks are always happy to sell you their time and, allow you to leverage their knowledge to do some of this compliance oversight conversation as well. And then the last thing would be fair contracting entities within, the state by which you're working. So they may be a resource as well to just reach out and say, how do I know this is good? Where can I get some training? And the DOL offers webinars at least a couple times a year, possibly local meetings now. I don't know with COVID, but that is my final thought.
Great. Well, thank you, Adam. That was extremely informative. We will make sure to share the slide deck with folks so that they can access these links too. While folks think about questions that they may have, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat. I'm curious, Eddie and Adam, from both of your perspectives, do you find that smaller businesses feel that they cannot comply with Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage, not because they can't afford the wages, but because they can't afford to, have somebody dedicated who's participating in the system and ensuring adequate reporting? And therefore, does it sort of favor larger companies as a result? I'm curious on, your thoughts on that.
You want to take that first, Eddie?
Sure, it's just a different business process for them, for a lot of them, and it's just an exposure to doing business that way. And in some instances, if they've dealt in that sector for a long time, it's no big deal because they already know how to do it. They have somebody in the company that knows how to do it. If they haven't done it, then it's going to be a challenge because it's something that it's new to them, and so they'll be looking for help, and some of them are willing to contract out for help and some others are not. And then the middle section of the group is we're going to figure it out as we do it, and which I applaud because they're going for it, but that just means that all of those who review are going to go through that learning curve of getting them up to speed, and you just got to be prepared for that.
I personally think it's less about the nature of a company and more about the nature of the people they employ, right? I think that anybody who's willing to participate in a pre-bid meeting, anybody who's willing to reach out and ask a question, anybody who's willing to receive that question and try to provide them material information, those people can succeed. I kind of like Eddie said, when you get those people that are fake it to make it folks, I guess for lack of a better term, you're on thin ice, I think, because there are certain situations in Davis-Bacon where if you don't, fringe benefit contributions, for instance, right? The CFR says to be considered paid in the week in which it was earned, which is generally a requirement of prevailing wage, those contributions must be made regularly, right? No less than weekly, no greater than quarterly. That's, to fit in this box, to be a benefit, you got to do that. And so I've had contractors who don't understand that, who say, I don't have to contribute to a benefit until I fire you, and then it's 3 months after that, who've had to come out of pocket for very large sums of money. And that can be very disruptive to a business. So I think it's more about, if you're willing to learn and give it your best shot. Generally, the smaller companies are going to pay everything on the check. It's really easy to look at. It's really easy for them to manage. When you get into some of those middle of the road companies that are, trying to offer some benefits, trying to figure out what those credits look like, it can get a little more dicey, especially if they don't have the knowledge necessary to do that.
And Sandy, one other thing, I talked to Department of Transportation earlier today. I know Adam gave me a referral to them that I appreciate. One of the things that they do is they actually find out the trades that are going to be on the project prior to construction and set up the prevailing wage rates on the contract so that there's no question, and they do that ahead of time. That's something we hadn't considered, but might be a possibility for us in the future.
We consider doing that as well. One of the things that I would caution that on is if the entire wage determination is incorporated into the contract, right? Then they conceptually are afforded the ability to use any of those wages. And so, if they had an occupation that was listed in a wage schedule, but not something that the agency incorporated, we could be impeding their submission. And then you get into two wrongs make them right when you're dealing with contractors generally, and that's probably not a place you want to be.
That's really interesting. I'm also curious sort of about the federal side of things. How do you interact with then the federal government and reporting, and, if they spot problems, what happens? And just curious about sort of that whole ecosystem on the federal side.
When the feds call, you smile and you say yes, because that's your only option. I guess it would depend on which feds, right? So, in prevailing wage on the highway side, we're talking, equal levels of Federal Highway Administration, U.S. Department of Labor. If one was taking action, the other one would say, hey, you've got a concern, go for it. And so they won't both talk at the same time usually, and that's kind of helpful. And I think it's incumbent upon us as subrecipients of federal money. We're doing these great things because they've entrusted us with these responsibilities. We're a quasi client customer in that situation. And so I would suggest taking, every step that you need to make sure that they have a good comfort level in your understanding what you're doing, and offer them the opportunity to have input as well.
The other thing too, Sandy, is it's always difficult. And, Adam said that they scrutinize their payrolls heavily early on. And then once they get in that rhythm, then they can go in more of a spot check basis. And our agency during ARA never went to the spot check mode, although we had the authority to do that. It's that we didn't feel comfortable of who to spot check and who not to spot check for fear of somebody gaming the system. And so we chose not to follow that process. So that's subjective, and that's just a difference in processes. Not one's right or one's wrong, it's just different.
Great, thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Adam. Pat, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. So Adam, thank you for your time today. And I'm just wondering if in Michigan or in any of the states that you're familiar with, if a third-party vendor such as you're using is used for multiple state agencies, or are, in your experiences, DOT would have one contract and it wouldn't be a statewide contract.
Are you talking like an LCP tracker or something of that nature? Is there, if you were to get onto a license, do multiple states accept that as a submission?
Not multiple states, but multiple agencies within the state. Could you have a sub, part for the energy office, or for someone else, like education, that would be doing things under IIJA?
That would depend on how the contract was authored and if the people who are in charge of it want to say yes or no, I think. So the way ours works is the agreement that we've struck with LCP Tracker as a vendor is extendable to any other state agency. The issue that it kind of gets into is, especially when you have a novice level of understanding about how a system works, you want to do a little resource sharing and grab people's time that probably isn't directly relative to your application of the system. And so, and I know that LCP Tracker also has they've got an offering on at the federal level on the GSA's website for software vendors. But as far as me hosting a database for someone else, or them putting projects in my database, I would say no, simply because there's no benefit to that, in my opinion. We've got the Gordie Howe International Bridge Crossing, which is technically highway, but also funded in large part and entirely by Canada. So that would have been the closest application of something that I would have allowed, but given the size and the scope and the duration, they got their own license for that.
Got it. Thank you.
And Pat, one other thing too is LCP Tracker also has pre-built templates. You got to make sure that those templates would apply or satisfy your needs at the agency level. And then there's security. I know that LCP Tracker doesn't have the multi-factor authentication set up. And if that's important to your agency, you got to know that as well. And I think in the LCP Tracker, they're a software as a service, right, Adam?
That is correct.
And so they normally pay based on volume of contracts is how they charge. And so if that's a pay model, the agency has to determine if that's a pay model that they'd be willing to accept as well.
Yeah, and there are a handful of vendors in the space. I've done a couple procurements in my time here. I think the last time we did it, my LCM was one. I believe EMARS does some stuff in the DoD space. I see a note in the chat for Ashdower project. It's actually their payroll service thing is a subdivision under that umbrella called Civil Rights and Labor. And so it deals with OJT, subcontractor payments, as well as the payroll side of things.
Stacy, thanks for the question. You asked Davis-Bacon will apply to all funding going forward, similar to Build American, Buy American, not just the Infrastructure Act. Is that correct? That I actually don't know. Eddie, Adam, I'm not sure if that's come across your desk at all, but that's something we can certainly look into after this meeting.
Yeah, it's a difference that Davis-Bacon applies. It's whether or not we have to check it and validate it. And so it applies across the board, but only in certain scenarios as part within the Infrastructure Act and within the State Energy Program, do we actually have to review the payrolls? They still have to certify that they're meeting those requirements.
Got it. So it sounds like it's still statutorily defined, like in the bill, as opposed to something that's required just by all federal investments in the same way.
Every contract we have has an attachment that says that you have to meet Davis-Bacon, wage rates.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, on our federal highway bill or on our federal highway proposal side, we get FHWA Form 1273, which says, Davis-Bacon, national pollution stuff, a whole bunch of different things. At our airports, we have the Airport Improvement Program voucher system. AIP is accompanied by Davis-Bacon requirements as well. So any of the federal money that we see is going to have Davis-Bacon attached to it.
And I think in general, go ahead, Eddie.
No, I'm just saying, for us, it's just a matter of whether they have to submit it and we have to review it.
Mm-hmm. Got it. I do think a general rule of thumb is for smaller residential projects, it's not required, but 5+ units, it does kick in. So I think things like the Energy Efficiency Revolving Loan Fund dollars through IIJA that are going through to like single family homes, I don't think that compliance is required, although some states may choose to require it. We'll check on that though.
Yeah, the weatherization assistance program has that caveat of under 5 units as well.
Great, thanks. Any other questions from our audience? Any fears, complaints, concerns that folks would like to air in this space?
It hasn't stopped us. I mean, we're still reviewing it. We're just not real fast at it. And so it's just part of the doing business. I mean, if you want to do business in this sector, for us, this is what's required of us, and for the contractors, it's required of them. And now probably in our last notice of loan fund application for ARA funds, it impacted, I think, the number of applicants. It reduced the number, but those that are good at it see it as an opportunity to really take advantage of it, because they know that the competition is going to be much smaller than it would otherwise be.
Thanks, Eddie. And just, would you happen to know how many people are dedicated to sort of Davis-Bacon prevailing wage compliance within your office? Is it like half a person or 5 people? Just so other states might have a sense of level of effort required.
Yeah, we have 2 contract managers who have projects that have Davis-Bacon compliance requirement, submittal review requirements. And with the IIJA, I'm imagining we're going to have maybe 4 more when all is said and done. The 2 that we have are for our ARA type projects.
Thanks. And then Adam, in your office, it sounds like this is sort of the core focus of your job, or are there multiple folks also dedicated to this?
It is the core focus of my job. I am over our entire prevailing wage program. So as of right now, that's 898 active contracts for $5.9 billion. As like the program specialist, the person who answers the questions generally, we've got something on the order of 22 project offices. It fluctuates a little bit throughout the entire state, and they could be seeing anywhere from $30 million to $400 million a year in active construction. And we have kind of pressure release valves in consulting firms and as needed contracts as well. Generally, every office has what we call an office tech, and they're responsible to review inspector reports, check materials, as well as certified payroll and everything else. So I think a lot of people, just kind of block off a day to certified payroll and say, I'm trying to get current every Wednesday kind of thing. And so it's, one person a day or a couple days a week with some consultant support if needed.
Great, thank you for that. Wonderful. Any other final questions from our group?
Sandy, I think we've got other states who've had to go through the same process that Texas has. I wonder if any of them has any additional insights.
Great
They're
point.
not willing to be vulnerable like that.
It sounds like folks might be rusty from the ARA era as well. So I think this is a good refresher. Great. Okay, well, if there are no other comments or questions, I'd really like to thank Eddie and Adam so much for your presentations and for the insights you shared. I think this will be a really great starting point for a lot of states over the coming months, getting ready for IIJA. And thank you all for tuning in today. Would love your feedback on topics or other ideas that we should be exchanging with as a group. So feel free to contact me or any of our partners at E4TheFuture to share your ideas. And otherwise, we'll give you 8 minutes back of your day. Thank you all. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.